Welcome to the Set to Lead podcast, the online mentoring platform for emerging and current leaders. My name is Marianne Samdi, leadership coach and talent development expert, and I will be your host. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks so much for being here, or for having me here, I should say. I'm excited to visit with you and your audience.
I'm excited as well. Today's show is about leadership effectiveness. But before we get started, would you kindly share your background with the audience?
Sure, thanks. I have been doing leadership research and consulting for about 20 years. Have been really fortunate to be in the room when some really unique ideas and discoveries around leadership happened, and then have had a chance to take those ideas to a few different continents at this point, working with executives in North America, Australia, and Asia. So been really fortunate to have some really great opportunities and work with some really amazing people along the way.
Phenomenal. I know you have a quote that's very popular where you say, 3/4 of your effectiveness as a leader comes from who you are, not what you do. Tell us what that means.
Yeah, well, that's actually a story about research. And I realize sometimes that statements like that, they sound like somebody just kind of put their finger in the air one day and say, oh, I bet it's about 3/4. But this story is actually very different than that. I was working with a boutique consulting firm in their leadership development division. And we had people up to the west side of Pikes Peak in Colorado here in the US for a week at a time. And we ran them through a number of assessments. And we would routinely get asked, what's the magic combination? If I took my personality and my natural abilities, would that automatically give me a better chance of being a more effective leader? And we had data on all these people. So one day we asked our resident number cruncher, Vanessa Kiley, if she could take our data and run it through and see if there was a correlation between personality, natural ability, and leadership performance. And I remember the night I went into her office and said, hey, what did you find? And she said nothing, because there was no correlation. She said, we didn't find anything. And I thought, okay, well, at least we have an answer now when our clients ask us, what is that magic combination? But just as I was leaving her office, she said, but we did find something we weren't looking for. And so I turned around. I was like, well, yeah, what's that? And what she had discovered, or really what the software had revealed, because, you know, the great thing, Marianne, about statistical software is it'll look for stuff in places where you aren't looking. It just does it automatically to say, where can we find other correlations? Mm-hmm. And our leadership assessment had 8 different aspects to it. So just think about a pizza that's got 8 different slices. Any 2 slices should make up 25% of that pizza. But what the statistical software, what the SPSS software found, is that we had 2 of our 8 areas that were accounting for almost 70% of the variability on the assessment. And then years later, Vanessa reran that data with 10 times the data points, and that number went up to 77%. So what that meant is that there were 2 areas of leadership that were more than 3 times more influential on how effective you were as a leader than the other 6 areas combined. And after sitting on that data for about 3 years, which is a funny thing to say now because now it looks so obvious, but it took us a little while to try to figure out what exactly did this data say? But ultimately, as we finally stepped back from it enough, we looked at those 2 areas and realized that those 2 areas were about who you are as a person, whereas the other 6 areas were about what you do as a leader. And that's where this statement came from. It was, if we want to be technically accurate, it's 77%. But if we're going to round off this statement a little bit, that's how we get to the statistically supported statement that 3/4 of your effectiveness as a leader comes from who you are, not what you do.
Okay. So I think with this assessment, you also categorize these areas into buckets, right?
Yes. So you're talking about kind of at the who and what level, or as we dive further into what do we mean by who?
I think as we go further and define what we mean by who, right?
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. Actually, we've got those two big areas that we're driving 3/4 of the variability. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So one of them is others focused, right?
Yep, that's right.
And the other one is inwardly sound. So define for our audience what that means.
Sure. We use 6 different ideas to make up this idea of what does it mean to be others focused. Mm-hmm. So we talk about being attentive, curious, empathic, humble, a Greek word called agapon, and finally the idea of being emotionally mature. When we combine those things together, you get somebody who shows up as a leader every day as somebody who is others focused, somebody who is more interested in the people around them, the people they're leading, than just their own bank account or their own power or their own advancement. That's an others focused leader when you bring all those things together.
So what are some key factors that you believe keep leaders from being others focused? Are there some examples that you could share that you see frequently?
Well, there are some very simple challenges to the human condition that I feel like it's almost like we're afraid to talk about them. I mean, I see lots of articles in very reputable organizations, very reputable publications, such as the Harvard Business Review, and they will start to lean towards these things, but they just stop short. It's almost like we're afraid to talk about who somebody is as a person. For example, you'll see plenty of articles in HBR about what does it mean to be empathic. That's actually gotten a lot of play in the last 5 years, but consistently they'll talk about empathy as strictly a skill set. But I think if you and I and our listeners, if you think about the people that you connect with in life, that are empathic, that connect with other people at emotional level, that feel their joy and feel their pain along with them, I think we would all say that's something more significant than a skill. That's something deeper than a skill. And so the idea here in terms of really digging in is we've got to pick up the rocks of behavior and look underneath of them, look into motives, look into perspectives. Ultimately, we've got to be able to go to that level. And so that ultimately causes us to say, hey, if you have, and I'll just put this on the financial terms, if you have a personal greed issue, you're going to be challenged to be an others focused leader because you're just doing it for your own bank account. Or as I mentioned, the other idea here that shows up a lot, if you have a conscious, not conscious, but a constant need for power and control, it's going to be tough for you to be an others focused leader because you're making it all about yourself. And so unfortunately, I think many of us have had examples where we're working for leaders who have various personal struggles like those. And look, they don't have to be at a psychosis level to be damaging in leadership. They can be just normal, everyday run of the mill power and greed that causes that leader to ultimately be more self-focused and others focused. And that makes them a less effective leader.
So, let's say that you lean towards being a power monger,
yeah.
And you lack empathy skills. Is there somewhere else? Is there a lane where they can be effective?
Well, it just limits their effectiveness. I mean, many times if we talk about who and what of leadership as 2 different categories, there's a whole host of things that the leader can do and be really effective at that don't include being others focused. So if we think about leaders that have exceptional vision, very strategic in their thinking, are great when it comes to execution, communicate really effectively, those are the what aspects of leadership that we typically talk about when we define leadership. So if you do those things well, you can still accomplish quite a bit as a leader, but statistically, 3/4 of it is who. And so you won't ever reach your fullest potential as a leader without becoming more inwardly sound and others focused. But that doesn't mean you can't produce good results in other ways. It's just you'll never reach your potential and you're neglecting 3/4 of the story.
Right. Good point. Being the other bucket you talked to is the emotional maturity component, right? Being inwardly sound. Now, that doesn't happen overnight, if I'm not mistaken, Tim.
None of this happens overnight, Mary Ann. You're right. Absolutely.
Right? This is not microwave leadership.
Thank you. Yes, I love that idea. I love that term. It's well said.
What are some simple and practical steps to discover and nurture who you are on the inside? How do you nurture that emotional maturity?
No, good. Well, let's break that down a little bit as we think about the broader idea of being inwardly sound. So these are our two big buckets: others focused and inwardly sound. Now, I mentioned emotional maturity previously as part of others focused, but it also plays a role here in being inwardly sound, because being emotionally mature has a foot in both worlds. Part of it is about how do I see and recognize and manage my own emotions, and then the other part of it is how do I do that regarding others' emotions. So it kind of plays in both worlds. But let me share with you the other 5 things that we address around being inwardly sound, and then I want to answer your question. But I just want to give you a kind of broader perspective on inwardly sound. When you think about being secure and settled as a person, which is essentially the opposite of being insecure, that's an important aspect of being inwardly sound. Self-awareness, which, Tasha Eurich has done studies, and she estimates, and this stat should scare all of us, that 10 to 15% of executive leaders are actually self-aware. I mean, that's problematic. And she lays out the reasons why it is so rare to find senior leaders who are actually self-aware. Now, I know a lot of us don't necessarily sit in that senior leadership role. We sit more at the front lines or in middle management. You know what? We are not immune from that either. In fact, as we sit in roles closer to the front lines, as we progress in our careers, we have to work really hard to maintain self-awareness as that power dynamic gets bigger and bigger. So that's another aspect of being inwardly sound. Finally, the last 3 would be principled. So are these people that I can trust? Do we see these, typical elements of being principled around courage, integrity, honesty, grit, authenticity, those type of things. And the last 2 are being holistically healthy and finally purposeful. And so, back to your original question, there are a number of different things we can do to tackle any of those areas. But I want to give one idea, just kind of a little exercise that somebody could do on a regular basis that I'll be honest with you, Mary Ann, it's a little bit scary, but we ask our clients to do it pretty regularly. And that's around the issue of being self-aware. Mm-hmm. One of the simple ways to grow in self-awareness and try to maintain it, even as you progress in your influence, is to create a habit of asking people for their feedback on what you're doing that makes a difference for them. The key here, though, is when you get feedback that you don't like or don't agree with, you simply have to resist being defensive. If you do that in any way, you can expect that feedback loop, especially in a leadership position, to dry up. So the idea is I want to hear a couple of things. I want to hear, what are the things that I'm doing that I should continue to do that are a big deal to you, that you feel like make a big difference for our team? And what are the things I need to change? What would make me more effective, or what would make our team more effective? And you go into that conversation. By the way, don't spring this question on somebody. Give them a week or 2 to think about it, and then have that conversation, and just be the most curious person you can possibly be. Even if you totally disagree with what you're hearing, you're getting a chance to hear and learn about somebody else's perspective on you. And as long as you don't get into that defensive mode or shoot the messenger or anything like that, if you make this just a regular practice where you're giving people an opportunity and you're thanking them and you're having gratitude for this feedback, again, regardless of what you agree or disagree with, you can begin to cultivate a rhythm and an openness within your own team so that they know it's okay to tell the boss that she or he is not all that in a bag of chips. That we need to hear about the things we can improve on. I'll also add in here, Mary Ann, it's important for us to hear about the things that we're good at, because sometimes we don't realize the things that we're doing that make the biggest difference for other people. We're kind of unconsciously being successful in those spaces. And it's important to be conscious of it so we can make sure that we continue to repeat this thing. So that simple idea of just saying, hey, what is it like to be on the other side of following me, and create space for people to have an honest dialogue with you, and fostering that regularly over the course of years.
Are you used to having, or I should say, seeing senior leaders go through this exercise?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is our this is our business, is that we help them take these two big ideas of being inwardly sound and others focused and saying, we want to go on a journey with you. And we call it a journey because that's what it is. It is hard. It is difficult. I mean, think about if you were trekking to the South Pole, you'd have a whole lot of enthusiasm and energy when you shoved off. But about halfway through, you might be saying, do I really want to do this? And of course, by then it's too late. You got to finish. You got to get to the destination. So we walk alongside leaders to help them take these steps and really investigate all these aspects of inwardly sound and others focused that we've been talking about. We want to dive deeply into each one of them because each one of them is complex. Each one of them has a lot of value in it. And frankly, each one of them at a certain level, if you just read a definition of it, it looks obvious and maybe even simple. But time and time and time again, in the leaders that we get a chance to travel alongside, the feedback will be this. When I first thought about the idea of, and let's just say, for example, being curious, one of the things we work on. When I first thought about the idea of that, I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's fairly simple. And I'm doing that most of the time. When we really dig into the nitty gritty and encourage people to hold up the mirror to their own leadership, what they discover is simple does not equal easy. And I'm doing it way less than I thought I was. And that's great because, awareness is progress at a certain level. That's the first step in taking steps forward. And then we help them think about ways, once they see where they land on that spectrum, whichever issue we're diving into, now we begin to take steps. Or what are the activities and practices where we can not just grow a skill, but become a person, a whole person that's really capable of these things 24 hours a day.
Excellent. As leaders start to discover feedback from their teams, what steps can they take to be their true selves, be true to themselves, be comfortable in their skin, but also not distance themselves from those they seek to lead? Can you be confident in your skin and also not offend? Sometimes I think that's a conflict.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm answering the question here. So what I want to ask you to do to make sure I'm on target here is, can you say a little bit more, maybe state the question in a different way or give me an example? Because I don't want to make too many assumptions here. I think I know what you're saying, but can you restate it and go through it a little bit for me?
Absolutely. So, for example, this is more about being comfortable in your skin because I believe that's part of being inwardly sound, correct?
It is. Yep, that's that personal, secure, and settled piece. Yes.
Right. So let's say that a leader is embracing that part of who they are is a very frank communicator. However, sometimes their delivery might be a little offensive to some people who do not share that communication style.
Yeah.
How do you balance confidence in who you are, but also make sure you don't distance yourself from others because of who you are?
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that.
No problem.
It's a really important question, and it comes back to a bit of a balancing idea of sorts. Andy Stanley is an incredible leader, and he talks about an idea between, distinguishing between problems to solve and tensions to manage, and that we should be wise to not try to attempt to solve a tension, because we'll just end up in a heap on the floor. And I think what you're talking about is exactly that. It's not a problem to solve, but it is a tension to manage, because I need to be me. But if I am so focused on only being me, and as a leader, I have no thought about how I am impacting others, then ultimately I may have swung too far. I don't want you, Marianne, if I'm following you, I don't want you to be this inauthentic, fake person. At the same time, I still want your empathy. I still want you to be attentive. I still want you to be somebody who's others focused. So if the core of who I am means that I can't be inwardly sound and others focused, then the core of who you are is going to limit your leadership effectiveness. But that's not normally the case for people. Normally, they're figuring out this tension that I speak of, which is, okay, I'm wired for frankness, but I care enough about being an effective leader and about the people that I'm leading that I realize I need to put that through a bit of a filter, not to become a different person, but to become, frankly, something that you mentioned earlier, to be emotionally mature. A great analogy around this that Dr. Mary Shippey taught me is the idea of an oil refinery. Now, when oil comes up out of the ground, before it goes through the refining process, what do we call it? We call it crude oil, which is to say it's oil, but it's not in a really usable form just yet. It goes through the refining process and a number of different products come out the other end, but one of those products is a more standard type of oil. In fact, some of that oil is not used as in our cars, but it's fuel. And that is an oil that has now been refined to be something very, very useful to power things. And so when I think about being an emotionally mature leader and managing something like my propensity to be super, super frank, I don't want to become somebody other than I am. I just want to take myself and kind of put my thoughts and words and actions through that refinery. It started out as oil. It came out as oil that powers something, but it's far more valuable on the other side. And so I apply emotional maturity, which means me recognizing my own emotions, but also recognizing the emotions of others. And so now I take somebody who has a tendency to be very frank, and I just, because I care about how this is landing, I just learn how to take the edges off a little bit while still being me. And now I become fully who I am, but also a more effective leader. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense to me. But you know what I'm thinking about as I listen to your example, which I think is phenomenal, is for someone who struggles with this constantly, is there a simple mental framework? Are there one or two questions they need to ask themselves to prep them for that way of thinking?
Well, I think maybe it's the very simple question of how is this going to land?
Okay.
Now, it is okay for us as leaders to do something that makes somebody else uncomfortable. In fact, sometimes we have to do that because we're trying to move somewhere. So the answer to that question isn't, well, if they feel uncomfortable, then I've got to do something different. No, but we want to be thoughtful about it ahead of time. We don't want to be reacting to our emotions and causing people to be uncomfortable without having thought it through first. And so the question of how is it going to land, and you can see now, I'm going to draw a connection up into the what of leadership for just a moment, because ultimately, effective communication, and that's part of the what we call the what of leadership. We can't afford to be leaders who put messages out into the world and then wash our hands of the results. See, our job isn't to just put something out. Our job is to drive people towards action and results. And so it's not enough for us to say, well, I told them 3 times and we're still getting a garbage result. If you told them 3 times and we're getting a bad result, maybe you need to adjust the way that you're telling them. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard senior leaders who will talk about people in the organization and they say, well, they just don't get it. Okay, well, maybe that's a them issue, but maybe that's a you issue. You're the leader. You're the responsible party for communicating effectively. And so all this gets back to this idea of I'm asking myself, how is this going to land? Because there's specific thinking and behavior that I'm wanting to drive. In other words, I'm wanting to be an effective communicator. And now we see the connection between the who and the what of leadership. My emotional maturity to manage my own emotions, my own self, and to think about the emotions of others. If I do that, now I become a more effective communicator because I'm thinking about how will this land? Will this drive the result that I'm hoping it will? Or is it really just about me getting something off my chest because I'm upset today? Right. The latter one is not a good leadership move. But if we think it through and say, okay, here's the result. And if I don't get my result, then I've got to adjust my communication. All of this shows that connection between who and what. And ultimately, that's how these things work together.
Excellent insight. Thank you so much for that, Tim.
Sure.
If you can't admit you've made a mistake, does that also reduce your effectiveness as a leader?
I'm laughing because I'm glad my wife isn't on the podcast right now. She might have some things to say about my ability to do this. Yes, is the short answer. It will reduce your ability. It will reduce your effectiveness as a leader. And part of this has to do with the issue of being humble. We love to follow humble leaders. Now, let me make a distinction here. There's a lot of times people get confused between humility and confidence. Humility means that the world is not revolving around me, but that doesn't mean that I think that I don't have any skills and ability. And so it's important to have that humble confidence. We don't want to have the whole world revolving around us. Part of being humble means that I am willing to see and admit fault. And in fact, right now, I'm working with about 25 different leaders right now on the issue of humility. And part of the assignment that we give them for about 6 weeks to 2 months is to lean into something called awareness of brokenness, which is to say we are all flawed people. And so we're actually going to spend a couple of months being on the proactive hunt for the contributions that we've made to problems. When a project doesn't churn out the exact result that we want to, admittedly, in many cases, there's been many people who have contributed to that. And so many times our temptation is to look around and point fingers and say, who committed the biggest errors here? But what we need to do, if we want to be the most effective leaders we can be, is we need to point those fingers at ourselves first and say, what could I have done differently? Now, maybe it's only a 5% adjustment. It doesn't have to be like I'm 100%. I committed all of the crimes here. That's probably not true, but there probably is something that you could have done better. And sometimes those are errors of omission, not commission, meaning maybe it's something I forgot to do or could have done and didn't do. And so the humble leaders will do that. They will look for their spot to say, you know what? I could have given you the instructions about the final result. I mean, I could have given you those out of the gate. I wasn't clear about that for the first 2 weeks of this project, and I think I could have done that better. Now, Marianne, what do you think happens to a team 95% of the time, and I'm just estimating on that number, when the leader steps into the room and says, I could have done something better here. I made a contribution to how this project could have gone better. What do you think the other people in the room do at that point?
I could be wrong, but I know someone like me says this person is real. They're down to earth and they're not above me. I can relate more to them.
You're exactly right. That is most often to the reaction. Now we feel a kinship, and there's also now been a modeling, an invitation. If the boss goes first and says, here's what I could have done better, now I see that authenticity, I feel a connection, and I also think, yeah, I could probably own my piece now too. So what happens when an entire team starts to own their piece rather than playing the blame game? What happens in that moment is we're all now focused on being better rather than distributing the blame. And now this is why being a really well-developed who actually drives a better bottom line result, because now our whole team is focused on fixing the problem and getting better instead of trying to not be blamed or playing politics. And all that energy goes towards being better. That's what it looks like the vast majority of time. Now, there are some rare exceptions to that in terms of I own my piece and everybody else says, yeah, it was your fault. Well, you know what? Those situations are so rare. But even in that moment, Marianne, think about what we're working on right now. We're working on being humble. Even in that moment, that humility muscle within me is strengthening. And over the long haul, which is important, everything we're talking about here is about long haul leadership success. There are 100 ways to be successful as a short-term leader. All of this is about long haul. Over the long haul, that humility will attract people to your leadership.
But how do you rewire someone's thinking who believes that if I were to admit my faults, I diminish my power?
Yeah. So oftentimes when somebody has that perspective, they also have the worldview that says the leader's job is to have all of the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have that perspective, they've got a really big problem. Because number one, they have to come up with all the answers. So are they going to listen to any of the other good ideas that their team has? No. And so now, again, connecting who to what, they've limited themselves strategically because they have to be the person with all of the answers because of how they define what a leader is supposed to do. And so they start off with a flawed mentality, and it works its way through everything that they do. And so it ultimately is going to limit them. And what we try to do in helping leaders who start out with a worldview like that or something very similar to it is we just try to show them what the data says about really well-developed who leaders, really inwardly sound and others focused. Mm-hmm. And once they see what that research is, and then we say, okay, if we see what that research says, now we're going to walk through the steps. When we run into that worldview that says, I have to have all the answers, we just have a conversation that's very similar to the one that you and I are having right now. And we just walk it out. Okay, if you have to have all the answers, do you really think that you're going to create the greatest strategic advantage because you're the only person that gets to speak into the final answer? Now, they might say yes, because I'm the smartest person in the room. And then we get to have a whole nother conversation. If you think that that's really true, let's talk about whether or not that's really true. And then we get to just go step by step into it. What usually happens over time is that they begin to see that that perspective of themselves and of the world is really in the long run holding them back. And then they begin to dip their toe in the water and try some spaces where they invite other people into decision-making and contribution. It's a slow process. I mean, you said earlier, this is not overnight development. This takes time, but we just try to work through the data and the logic to help them see that there is a more effective way for them to lead.
Okay. Leadership goes both ways. I think you would agree with that, Tim. When you see underperformance from a leader or a follower, mm-hmm. is there any way that an individual can improve their respect and grace when they witness those situations?
Tell me what you mean a little bit more about when you say improve their respect and grace.
So if you're a leader and you have a team that's underperforming, what are some examples of respect that you can emulate to that team, even in the midst of underperformance? Okay. This really goes to our conversation last time when we were talking about grace, and how we've noticed that grace is sometimes very limited in the corporate workspace. Grace when employees are exiting an organization, grace from leaders when things go wrong. And so when I say that leadership goes both ways, even followers notice leaders who aren't acting properly with integrity, or leaders who aren't doing the right things. And sometimes I think that there's a lack of grace and respect for individuals that haven't reached their potential.
Yeah. Okay. Really, thank you for clarifying. So there's a really interesting study that came out in Harvard Business Review in spring of 2015 from KRW. KRW is a consulting firm based out of Minneapolis here in the U.S. And they did a fascinating study. They took a look at four things. They took a look at integrity, responsibility, compassion, and forgiveness. They looked at four things in the executive suite. And by the way, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I saw that somebody was doing research in the senior executive suite around compassion and forgiveness. Like, the integrity and responsibility piece didn't surprise me that much, but the fact that they were doing survey work around those two things was really surprising to me. And when I think about especially those two areas of compassion and forgiveness, grace is something that I think touches in with both of those things. The grace to see the situations that people are coming from and where they're in, to be not accepting of poor performance, but accepting of the reality that they come to the exercise in. And then forgiveness, like, who's talking about forgiveness in business? I give KRW a lot of credit for their boldness and willing to do it. Well, they did this study, and they were looking at bottom line financial results. And they looked at the top 10 executives and executive teams as they tested out in these four areas, and the bottom 10 executive teams that they tested out in these four areas. And they found that the top 10 team had a return on assets of 4.8 times the bottom 10%. In other words, things like integrity, responsibility, compassion, compassion and forgiveness actually hit the bottom line. And so ultimately, does that mean that we are accepting of poor performance? Of course not. We can't accept poor performance. We have to address it. But when you talk about grace bearing, I think we're talking about, how do I address it? Do I address it with frustration and anger? And really, a thing I think that comes in really hardcore on that is judgment. Like, I would never do the job that you're doing. You're doing a terrible job. I would never accept that. I'm talking about the stories, the words we say in our own heads and our own hearts. Now, that's not usually how we would say it to the person, but somebody can feel when we're having that type of frustration, anger, and judgment towards them. Versus this gets back a little bit to the worldview about self and leadership. If my team is not producing results, I wonder if there's some way that I'm contributing this. You see, we're back to the humility part again. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's something I could be doing better. I think I mentioned Andy Stanley earlier. I mentioned him again. He has a really great idea about when you approach people. What about talking with them about systems as opposed to the individual? Which is to say, okay, your team is producing 10% product, whatever we're manufacturing here. You're missing your production numbers over the last 3 months by 10% every single time. So let's talk about your process. Tell me about your process. Tell me where are you seeing some things that maybe could be the reason. I'm with you. Let's stand beside each other instead of against each other, and let's take a look at your process. And do you feel the difference here? I'm essentially assuming that they want to do a good job. Now, I realize once in a while, you're going to run into somebody who just isn't interested in doing a good job. Personally, I have not found that to be the case very often, once in a while. So I start off with the belief that this person wants to do a good job. And now over time, we might discover that they just don't have the capability. And in that case, we're going to have to move somebody else into the position. But while you're trying to evaluate the lack of performance, you're standing beside somebody and saying, let's take a look at your system. Tell me about it. Tell me where you think this might be breaking down. We're problem solving together. Now, we have to hit the performance measures. We have to raise this 10%. There's not an option on that. But in light of the environment, in light of our supplier issues, in light of our production schedules, let's talk together about the system that you're managing, and let's see if we can figure out where some of the challenges are. And let me also say, maybe I'm part of the challenge. Maybe there's something I'm doing that's slowing you guys up, that's hurting the process. And if so, I want to fix that. And so hopefully what you hear in an example like that is curiosity and empathy and humility, so it can show up to say, I'm with the people that I'm leading. Therefore, what comes into that in a way is the issue of grace, to say, hey, this isn't going well, but I'm not going to damn you because of that. I'm going to work with you because of that. Does that get to the grace and respect part you're talking about?
Absolutely, Tim. Absolutely. And I think this was all great insight. I hope the audience really, it resonates with the audience, but we've reached the end of our show today.
Well, I'm so appreciative of the chance to talk through these things. It's a deep passion for me to get to share these ideas with people. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for coming by. Tim, before you go, tell the audience how they can follow you and your work.
Sure. You can find us easiest at onlyleaders.com, theonlyleaders.com. And we have a place there if you're interested in signing up to be a part of our email list. We have I have a book, and we've got a discussion guide that's coming out with the book here soon. So you would get that for free if you're a part of the email list. And we also have a code. And Marianne, you get to make up the word here. We have a coupon code. As I mentioned earlier, we take leaders on these experiences that we call journeys. It's not actual physical journey, but it's a journey inward to grow and develop in who you are. And we want to give a special discount to your listeners. So what should be the word that they have to put into the coupon code to get that discount?
I choose Leaders Rise.
Okay, Leaders Rise. So if you put Leaders Rise in the coupon code and you end up joining us for one of our journeys starting in 2021, we will take $500 off of the price for you because you were a listener here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim.
Marianne, thank you.